Hi, I'm Eric Nierstedt, author of the Pantheon Saga, and welcome to the first in a series of videos I'm making on the different books and other media that have inspired me on my writing journey. Now, there are a lot of different things I want to talk about on this series, and if you've read my work, you know there's one book that I will be discussing in depth, and I will get to that one. But I wanted to start with the first book that I think put me on the journey to being the writer I am today. Now, the story of this book begins way back in the mid-90s. That long ago period where I was about 13 years old, and like every other 13-year-old at that time, I was reading the book series known as Goosebumps. Yes, before there was Harry Potter and Twilight and all the other book series that we go on today, there was Goosebumps. Now, if you're one of the newer kids who have no idea what this was a series of child-friendly horror books written by R.L. Stine. Now, these came out about once a month. Most of the kids I knew were reading them, and so was I. And they were what they were. But my mother, in perhaps one of the best things she ever did for me, actually took the time to read one of these books, and after doing so, went to the library, took out a couple of books, and said to me, "Eric, these books you're reading are crap. Here's this." She may have been right. Now, one of those two books she got me was The Dead Zone by Stephen King, and that's a book I do want to talk about at some point. But this is the book I really want to discuss, which is called Different Seasons. Now, this is also a Stephen King book, as you can tell. And if you're thinking this is a horror novel, you'd actually be wrong. This is a series of 4 novellas or short novels that King compiled and put into this collection. Now, it's called Different Seasons because he gave each one a subtitle relating to a different time of the year. For example, Hope Springs Eternal, Summer of Corruption, Fall from Innocence, and A Winter's Tale. And this was really the first Stephen King book that I ever sank my teeth into, and it was probably a good thing for me because I was not really into horror books, or at least really strong horror books at the time. As for now, okay, I might have a problem. But at the time, this was a new experience for me. And each of these stories, while they're not horror tales, for the most part, do bring very different things to the table to someone who hadn't really read this kind of adult literature before. So the first story, Hope Springs Eternal, has the proper title of Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. Yes, that's Shawshank Redemption. So if you didn't know, Stephen King also wrote one of the most beloved movies of the 20th century. Now, if you've seen the film version of Shawshank, it's not that different from the book version. There are a few minor details with what happens to one of the characters. Morgan Freeman's character is Irish, but other than that, it's the exact same person. So there's not too much to comment on, and I don't want to give away too many of these stories, but it's absolutely a great read just because you get to go deeper into the character's mindset, especially Red's, since he's the narrator, and really kind of see what's going on in their minds and what's happening in the story. So it's a very good first story, and obviously it has all the great uplifting qualities you know from the film. And it's a very good thing it does because the next story, the Summer of Corruption story, is called Apt Pupil, and that too was made into a film. That said, I actually find it to be probably the most disturbing story Stephen King ever wrote. And that's including Pet Sematary and The Shining and all those other horror novels that you think of when you think Stephen King. The premise of this story is about a young boy in California who finds that one of his neighbors is actually an escaped Nazi war criminal. And rather than turn this person in, the boy decides he wants to hear the stories from this man, and as he puts it to him, "I want to hear all the stuff they don't tell us in school." And it's legitimately one of the most disturbing stories I've ever read. It's not traditional horror in the sense that we think of it, but it's absolutely just very hard to get through in points. And to this day, when I reread this book, despite how much I love it, that story is always hard to get through, and it always leaves an impression on you every single time. So, and it's probably the reason the book had to start on such a more uplifting note with Shawshank, because this story is a gut punch. The next story, though, Fall from Innocence, is called The Body. And this one was also made into a film called Stand By Me, which is one of my favorite movies. And this is also my favorite story in the collection. Again, if you've seen the movie, it's very, very similar. It's about four young boys in the last days of summer before they go into junior high who go on a weekend-long quest to find the dead body of someone who was lost in the woods a couple of days ago. And honestly, again, the movie is a very good adaptation of the story, but for me, it was a really unique experience because these were kids about the same age I was who were going through a lot of issues that I could relate to. I remember the main character especially is an aspiring writer, feels that he's not understood and doesn't quite know where he fits in the world. And those are very real feelings that whether you are at that age or even older, you can experience. And it was the first time I'd ever read something that had a character or character development that I could really follow and go like, I completely understand where this person is and who this person is trying to be. So again, it was a great story. It also does not have sort of a clean Hardy Boys type resolution where the good guys win and everything goes out. It's more of a bittersweet ending, but again, that's something I had not been exposed to before, and it was really riveting to me to read that. The final story in here, Winter's Tale, is known as the breathing method, and this is kind of the oddball out of the book. I think in the afterword, Stephen King said that his new agent had suggested, maybe you should just write one horror story for your audience. And he did come up with a pretty good one. Honestly, I always felt it read like something out of The Outer Limits or The Twilight Zone. But at the same time, it's the only one of the book's stories that has not been made into a film, so take that as you will. But it's a very, very good horror story for what it is. It's about a doctor regarding the tale of a woman that he attended to in the 1940s, I believe, who was pregnant out of wedlock and extremely determined to give birth. And that's all I'm going to say on it. But it's very well done. If you are a fan of King's horror work, this is definitely a good story for that. It does feel a bit odd compared to the others, even because especially since The Body and Shawshank are more realistic stories, and Apt Pupil is, again, sort of real-world horror, so some of the elements of the breathing method don't quite gel with that, but it's still a good story, just sort of a very oddball in this collection. Now, that said, this is still probably my favorite Stephen King book, and I have read quite a few. God, I've been busy. But it still holds up to me because it was my introduction to King and his style of writing. And there are plenty of flaws with Stephen King's approach, and I'll be the first to admit that. But I've always felt that his great strengths and things I've taken from him were that he has great characters that seem to be real people and have real needs and wants and desires that you can understand. Even some of his villainous characters have that. That it showed how you can tell, more grounded stories that still are about things like hope and, becoming the person you were meant to be, and realizing that sometimes the people we know aren't really the people we think they are. And again, for someone who was used to R.L. Stine, these were books that, opened a world to me. And I still consider this to be one of the more seminal books I've ever read as a writer. So as my mom did to me, and I happily do, and I happily continue, definitely read this book if you haven't already. even if you're familiar with the films based on it, it's a different experience reading it from the book. Not a completely different one, but still a different approach to a familiar story, and it's well worth your time to check that out. And I hope you've enjoyed this little trip down memory lane for me, and I'll be back soon with another book, with another piece of media that influenced me. But until then, keep reading.